This week's parsha, Parsha Yisro, of course, is the parsha of giving of the Torah. I'd like to speak about some of the familiar Mamarei Chazal that relate to Kabbalah Torah. The pasuk says that they traveled from Refidim and they came to Midbar Sinai. Vayachanu b'Midbar, they camped in the desert. Vayicham sham Yisrael neged ahar, and Yisrael camped there before the mountain. So there is a change, a grammatical change in this pasuk. In the first half of the pasuk, the Jews are spoken of in plural. Vayisu, Vayavohu, Vayachanu. And then in the middle, it changes to the singular. Vayicham sham Yisrael. The Jews camped there, but the verb form is singular. So Rashi quotes Maimar Chazal from the Mechilta that ki ish echad b'leiv echad. That in this encampment they were as one man with one heart. There was a total unity. So what's the significance of this fact? That this chaniyah, this encampment, was ki ish echad b'leiv echad. I'd like to point out a ha'ara that relates to the halacha. The halacha is if a person makes a commitment, he makes a shvuah, an oath, the oath is not binding on his descendants. A shvuah is a personal obligation. I swore to do X, I have to do X. But if I don't do it in my lifetime, my heirs are not obligated to fulfill the shvuah. It's my obligation, it's not their obligation. The question is, why is the Kabbalah Torah, therefore, binding on future generations? Those who stood at Har Sinai, they, in theory, are obligated. But why should their successors be obligated? And perhaps one is tempted to answer. As Chazal say, all the Shemos of Klal Yisrael were at Maimad Har Sinai, so perhaps they also participated in the Kabbalah. But the Maral explains a very, very simple answer. That this klal, this rule, that a shavua is not binding on future generations, only applies to the shavua of an individual. But the shavua of a nation, is binding on future generations. And the concept is very much like the concept of a corporation. Because a corporation has an identity apart from its shareholders. So if a corporation makes a commitment and enters into a contract, this is binding as long as the corporation exists. Even if all the current shareholders sell their stock to new shareholders who were not owners at the time that the contract was created, it's nevertheless binding. Because this corporate identity has a perpetual nature, and its commitments are in force as long as the corporation is in force. So it is with a nation. If a nation enters into a treaty, 200 years later, the nation is still bound by the treaty. If the corporate entity of the nation has made a commitment, the fact that its constituent members are not the same as at the time the treaty was made is irrelevant. If an individual makes a shvuah, it's not binding on his heirs. But if there's a shavua of the nation as a whole, so that is binding on descendants. And that's why there's the emphasis. The Klal Yisrael Har Sinai was not just a assembly of individuals. It was ki ish echad b'leiv echad. They were a single nation, which has an identity which is perpetuated. And therefore, for this reason, the shavua of Har Sinai, the Kabbalah Torah, is binding on future generations. There's another Maimar Chazal, famous Maimar Chazal. It says that when they came to the day of the Great Revelation, Vayisyatzu b'sachta sahar, they stood under the mountain, literally under the mountain. So what does this mean? So the Gemara Masechah Shabbos, Rashi quotes a bit of it, says the following. Amr Avdinu Rachasa, Milamet Shekafa Kadosh Baruch Hu Aleim Esahar Kegigis, HaKadosh Baruch Hu held the mountain over their heads like a barrel. V'amar and said, if you accept the Torah mutav, good. And if not, shamtei kvuraschem. This will be your burial place. This will be your burial place. So there was duress. They were forced to accept the Torah. Amar Rav Bar Yaakov, said Rav Bar Yaakov, Mikan, from here we see Moidah Rabbo L'Iraisa. There was a Moidah, a great Moidah on the Torah itself. What's a Moidah? A Moidah is an advanced declaration of duress. Let's say, for example, a person foresees that he's going to be forced into some type of transaction, giving a gift, making a sale, etc. And he doesn't want it to be legally binding, so he makes a declaration in advance in front of witnesses called a Moidah, in which he says that any transaction that I enter into regarding this piece of land, let's say, is null and void. It's under duress, and this way he has recourse later on to go to a bezdin with the Moidah and claim his land back. So that's a Moidah, an advanced declaration of duress. So it seems here there's a Moidah on the Torah itself, that the Kabbalah Torah is not binding, because the Jews were forced into it. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Afal Piche, nevertheless, Hadar Kiblu B'Me'achashverosh. The Jews did accept the Torah ultimately in the times of Achashverosh. The Chesiv, it says in the Pasuk, Kimu v'Kiblu HaYehudim. The Jews ratified and accepted. Literally refers to the ordinance of Purim. But Chazal say that Kimu v'Kiblu means Kimu Mashakiblu Kfar. They ratified that which they had once accepted before, or that which they accepted at Har Sinai. But there it was under duress. In the aftermath of the Purim story, they accepted willingly. So this is an amazing thing, that the standing under the mountain, in a sense, invalidated the entire Kabbalah Torah. There was no Kabbalah, because it was under duress, they were forced. There's a Moidah Rabbah on the Torah. Now Tosfos asks the question over here, very interesting question. According to the chronology of Chazal, this Vayisyatzu B'Tachta Sahara, this standing under the mountain, was either on the 6th or the 7th day of Sivan. That's the machlokas, whether the revelation was on the 6th or the 7th. But already on the 5th day, there was the Krisas Bris, there was the establishment of the covenant, which is described in PARSHA's Mishpatim, next week's PARSHA, at which the Jews said Nasa v'Nishma. The Jews accepted Torah willingly. So the question is, if they already accepted the entire Torah willingly on the 5th of Sivan, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu have to compel them either on the 6th or the 7th? They already accepted the Torah willingly on the 5th. So Tosfos gives an answer, a very puzzling answer. He says, Shema Iyu Chayzrim, maybe they would have backed out Kishiro Ha'esh HaGedolah, when they saw the great fire. Sheyotza Nishmos, their souls departed. Chazal tell us that there was such a fright at the Maimon Har Sinai, their souls departed. So they would have been chayzer from their acceptance of Nasa v'Nishma, and therefore they have to be forced not to be chayzer, not to back down. So the Maral is greatly puzzled by this. The Maral says that from Chazal, in many places we see that when the Jews said Nasa v'Nishma, this was a great merit. How is it possible that it should be counted as such a great merit if in fact they would have been choser 2 days later? So the Maral gives another answer. The Maral says that it's true that there was a voluntary acceptance of Torah on the 5th of Sivan. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu nevertheless held the mountain over their heads to impress upon them a very important idea. You see, if a person voluntarily accepts something, he tells himself, it happens to be I accepted it, but if I would have wanted to, I could have rejected it. And it was very important, says the Maral, that the Jews understand that Torah is not a take it or leave it proposition. Torah is something which is necessary. Torah must be. Torah is the entire Seder, the order, the structure of the universe. A world without Torah cannot exist, and therefore the Jews of necessity must accept the Torah. How did HaKadosh Baruch Hu impress it upon them? By holding the mountain over their heads, even after they'd already voluntarily accepted it. So they accepted it on the 5th, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu held it over their heads on the 6th or 7th to impress upon them, yes, you accepted it voluntarily yesterday, but don't think that you could have rejected it. I'm showing you by holding it over your heads that Torah is something which must be. The problem is, that according to the Maral, where is the Maidar Abel Araisa? Where is the advanced declaration of duress? If really they did not back down from the Nasa V'Nishma, if the Nasa V'Nishma of 2 days before was still in effect, then there was a valid, voluntary Kabbalah Satorah in place. So what is the Maidar Abel Araisa? What is the duress? According to the Maral, the whole holding the mountain over their heads was only a demonstration of the chashivos, of the importance of Torah. But it wasn't integral to the acceptance of Torah. The voluntary acceptance of 2 days before was still in force. So what does the Gemara mean when it says Maidar Abel Araisa? So we're left with this question. Tosfos' question, we don't have a satisfactory answer, that if HaKadosh Baruch Hu in fact had heard the Nasa V'Nishma 2 days before, why was it necessary to hold the mountain over their heads and force them? Okay, put that question in the back burner. There's a question which the Ramban deals with. Very fascinating Ramban. If in fact it was a Maidar Abel Araisa, that means the Kabbalah Satorah was invalid. And it was only in the time of Achashverosh, after the Churban Beis HaMikdash, after the Churban Bayis Rishon, that ultimately the Jews accepted the Torah again. So why were they liable for their sins all the years of the first Beis HaMikdash? We know Chazal tell us the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of various sins. Avodah Zarah, Shvichas Damim, Gilui Arayas. So why were they liable? The Kabbalah Satorah was invalid. There was a Maidar Abel Araisa. There was an advanced declaration of duress. They weren't bound by the Kabbalah Satorah. So why were they punished? Why were they exiled from Eretz Yisrael? So the Ramban says a very, very fascinating thing. The Ramban says that as long as the Jews were in Eretz Yisrael, they were obligated to keep the Torah even without a Kabbalah. Even though the acceptance was invalid, but in Eretz Yisrael they were still bound. And the Ramban says, because Eretz Yisrael was only given to them on the condition that they observe the mitzvahs. And there's an expression which we learn from the Psukim Divrei Hayamim, that Torah is called Mishpat Elohei Haaretz. It is the law of the God of the land. Eretz Yisrael is Hashem's land, and if you want to live there, you got to keep the law. So therefore, says the Ramban, there's no kasha why the Jews were liable as long as they lived in Eretz Yisrael. It's almost like the idea of Dina de Malchus Dina. The law of the government is the law. If you're living in the country, you have to follow the laws. So even though the Kabbalah Satorah was invalid, but in Eretz Yisrael, they had to observe the laws. Ultimately, they were exiled from Eretz Yisrael. So when they were exiled from Eretz Yisrael, they said, well now, there's no point. Because outside of Eretz Yisrael, we're not in God's land. And as far as our original acceptance of Torah, there was a Maidar Abel Araisa. So it's true that there never was a Kabbalah Satorah, but the fact that there was no Kabbalah Satorah only became relevant after the exile from Eretz Yisrael. As long as they were in Eretz Yisrael, they were obligated to observe the Torah because Eretz Yisrael was only given to them on the condition that they observed the laws. But outside of Eretz Yisrael in Golos, now the only thing that would obligate is the original Kabbalah Satorah. On the original Kabbalah Torah, they said there's a Moidar Rabbi Raisa. And the Ramban brings an interesting medrash. In the time of Yecheskel, they came to the Rebbeinu, to the Navi Yecheskel, the Zekanim, and they said that now we should be like all the Gentiles. Because now we're not in Eretz Yisrael. Why should we be obligated? In other words, they wanted to invoke the Maidah. So the Gemara says that this was only for a while, but after the Purim story, and then they accepted the Torah willingly. This is what the Ramban says. There's a Chara Kash on the Ramban. There's one thing the Ramban seems to overlook. Why were the Jews held liable for the Averis they did in the Midbar? In other words, the Ramban says that in Eretz Yisrael they were liable because that's Mishpat Haaretz. You can't live in Eretz Yisrael unless you observe the law. That is the condition. God gave us Eretz Yisrael on the condition we observe the law. So in Eretz Yisrael we're liable. Once we left Eretz Yisrael, that's where the Maidah becomes operative. Because now the only obligation is the Kabbalah. As far as the Kabbalah, we are not bound. Because it was a Maidah. It was under duress. So, in the same way that after we left Eretz Yisrael we wouldn't be liable, before we came into Eretz Yisrael we also shouldn't be liable. It's not Mishpat Elohei Haaretz. So in the Midbar, the only obligation is because of the Kabbalah. But if there was a Moidar Rabbi Raisa, why were they responsible for the sins they committed in the Midbar? And the Torah is a quite lengthy record of sins committed in the Midbar. And the Chata Egel and the Chata Meraglim, and you have on the individual levels, you have the Makalel and the Makoshesh. There's so many sins that were committed. If the Kabbalah Torah was invalid, and here they're not yet in Eretz Yisrael, so why are they held liable for the sins committed in the Midbar? Now the Ramban doesn't answer. I'd like to point out that there's a very, very simple answer to this question, and it may help us in turn answer Tosa's question. What does it mean? HaKadosh Baruch Hu held the mountain over their heads like a barrel. Do we take that literally? Is it a metaphor? What does it mean? The Meshech Chochmah says that it's really a mashal. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't hold the mountain over their heads. It means that the experience of Maimon Har Sinai, their apprehension of the Shekhinah, was so powerful that they did not see an alternative to accepting the Torah. Because we live in a time of Hester Panim, a time of concealment. So is HaKadosh Baruch Hu watching? Isn't he watching? Does he care? Does he not care? So the potential for self-delusion, for fooling ourselves, exists today. So a person could not accept the Torah. But if you stood at Har Sinai and you saw the thunder and the lightning and the smoke and the fire, and you had a prophetic experience of the Shekhinah, so, and now you're asked the question, do you accept Hashem's commands or do you not accept them? In that situation, there's no alternative. There's no possibility of doing the opposite. You have to do it. That's the Har Kagigas. That's the mashal. In the same way that when there's a mountain over your head and you're facing death, you feel you have no choice. The Jews genuinely had no choice. So l'chayra, why is there a Moidah Rabbi L'Raisa? So why is the Torah therefore not binding? To the contrary, it should be more binding, more compelling. And the answer is very simple. For the Jews who stood at Har Sinai, of course it was binding. Not because of their voluntary acceptance, It was binding because they saw with clarity that Hashem exists and Hashem commands and Hashem wants, and therefore how could they not do it? No question. Those people that stood at Har Sinai, they were bound. Not because they had a voluntary acceptance of Torah. They were bound because there's no alternative. They have to accept. But the question is, would it be binding on their descendants? If I am bound because of what I understand through my prophetic experience, that's only for me. My children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren don't have that same experience. It wouldn't be binding on them. They could only be bound because of a voluntary acceptance that I made. But if I made no voluntary acceptance, therefore they aren't bound. Let me illustrate this with two mishalim that might give it clarity. There's a question that Rabbi Chanan Bassim Zecher Tzadik Levracha asks in the Kuntras Divrei Seifrim. Asks like this: the shita of the Ramban is that when the Torah says we have to listen to the Beis Din Hagadol, lo sasur min hadavar sheyagidu locha, don't swerve from their instructions, and so on and so forth, that only is applicable when the Beis Din is interpreting the Torah. When the Beis Din interprets the Torah, I have to accept their interpretations. But when the Chachamim legislate new mitzvahs, we are not bound because of those Torah rules of lo sasur to follow them. That's the Ramban Shita. The Rambam disagrees, but the Ramban Shita is that this that the Torah says we have to follow the Beis Din Hagadol is only when they are interpreting the Torah. When they legislate new mitzvahs such as Purim, Chanukah, Netilas Yadayim, etc., that is not explicit in the Torah that we have to follow the Chachamim. So asks the B'chana Vasaman, so why do we have to follow the Chachamim? Because why do we have to observe mitzvahs d'Rabbanan? If when the Torah says lo sasur and al pi Torah asher yarucha, that there's a mitzvah to follow the Beis Din, it only applies when the Beis Din is interpreting the Torah, not when they're legislating. So why, in fact, do we have to do mitzvahs d'Rabbanan? What for? So B'chana says a very simple thing. He says like this: if we would understand that something is the Ratzon Hashem, even if it was not explicit in the Torah, but through reflection, contemplation, we would come to understand that if the Baruch Hu wants X, would we have to do it? Says the B'chana, of course we'd have to do it. How could we not do it? If we understood through reason that Hashem wants a certain thing, of course we have to do it. The Gemara says in several places on certain halachas, Lama likra, why do we need a pasuk? Tell me this halacha, svaruhu, it's logical. What do you mean? I don't need a pasuk because it's logical. Why do I have to follow logic? It's pasuk. If through logic, through reason, you understood something is the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course you'd have to do it. To the extent that the Gemara says, I don't even need the pasuk to write it because it's a svara. I know it through reason. So anything we understand through reason as being the Ratzon Hashem, of course we have to do it. Says the B'chana, it's pashut that Hashem wants us to listen to the Chachamim. It could be that the explicit psukim in the Torah are speaking about when the Chachamim interpret the Torah. But of course, the Chachamim, who are those who truly understand and take responsibility for Klal Yisrael, certainly Hashem wants us to follow their guidance. That's why we have to observe mitzvahs d'Rabbanan. It's true that at Maimon Har Sinai there was no valid Kabbalah, there was no valid acceptance, there was no valid oath, if you will. But from the experience they understood that it's through Ratzon Hashem that we accept His mitzvahs, so of course they were bound. Those people who had that apprehension, who had that experience, of course are bound. But since it wasn't a voluntary Kabbalah, it wouldn't be binding for future generations. Let me give you a second mashal, which I think brings out another aspect of this. There's a Gemara in Maseches Brachos that says that if a person is makabel Shabbos early, let's say you accept Shabbos early, so you can't do malacha. So let's say, for example, Shkia, sunset is in the summer, 8:30, and you make early Shabbos, you make Shabbos at 7 o'clock. After 7 o'clock, you can't do any malacha. You were makabel Shabbos. So the Gemara tells a Maisa that there was once a situation where it got dark, and they thought that Shabbos began, and they stopped doing malacha, and then the clouds cleared, and they saw it was still broad daylight. So the Gemara says they're allowed to go do malacha again. So the Gemara says, why? Weren't they makabel Shabbos? So the Gemara says, Sahutu Usa. That was a mistake. So Rashi says, what was the mistake? They weren't makabel Shabbos because they thought it was already Shabbos. Kabbalah Shabbos means you know it's not yet Shabbos, and yet you accept upon yourself Shabbos. But if you thought it already was Shabbos, because it was very dark, so you stopped doing malacha, there was no Kabbalah Shabbos. You didn't accept Shabbos. You thought it was already Shabbos. You thought the sun had already gone down. So there was no Kabbalah Shabbos. Now the clouds part, and you see it's broad daylight, so there was no Kabbalah Shabbos. You can go back to doing malacha. So here too, in other words, from what Klal Yisrael understood at the Ma'amad Har Sinai, there was no alternative. They had to accept the Torah. So there was no voluntary Kabbalah. A voluntary Kabbalah is where you perceive that there is an alternative. I perceive there is an alternative, and nevertheless I accept. So that's a Kabbalah which binds future generations. But if they had such clarity at the Ma'amad Har Sinai, so the Bemis was no Kabbalah. They understood they have to do it. If this is what Hashem wants, of course they have to do it. But it's not a Kabbalah, it's not an acceptance. It's like the person who keeps Shabbos thinking it's already night. He has to. But there's no Kabbalah Shabbos. So therefore here too, of course in the Midbar they were bound. Not because of their voluntary Kabbalah. They were bound because they understood from the experience of Ma'amad Har Sinai that Hashem wants us to observe His mitzvahs. If they understood that's the Ratzon Hashem, then how could they not perform them? But it wasn't the Kabbalah that would bind future generations. So in future generations, why were they responsible? There was no voluntary Kabbalah that would bind the future generations. So on that, the Rambam says the answer is because Eretz Yisrael was given on a condition. But Avada in the Midbar, where they had a direct apprehension of the Ribono Shel Olam, so of course they were bound. Not because it was a voluntary Kabbalah. They were bound despite the fact there was no Kabbalah. They were bound. So it comes out really that there are three different ways of being obligated to observe the Torah. There could be observance of the mitzvahs as a condition for living in Eretz Yisrael. It's mishpat Elohei ha'aretz, that's the law of the land. You can't live in Eretz Yisrael and not observe the Torah. That's not a voluntary Kabbalah, that's a condition of living in Eretz Yisrael. There's an idea that you have such clarity from the experience of the Ma'amad Har Sinai that you are bound even in the absence of a Kabbalah, even though, as far as you're concerned, there is no alternative choice. But you're bound because if this is what Hashem wants, it must be. There's no choice at all. And then there is the possibility of a voluntary acceptance of Torah. So in Har Sinai, there was no voluntary acceptance of Torah. In the Midbar, they were bound because of the compelling vision of Ma'amad Har Sinai, which is what Kaf Aleim HaGigis really means. And in Eretz Yisrael, they were bound in later generations because it was Mishpat Elohei Haaretz. And therefore the Maidah becomes relevant only after the Churban Beis HaMikdash and the Golus Babel. So at that point, they don't have the compelling vision of Ma'amad Har Sinai. On the other hand, they don't have the Mishpat Elohei Haaretz. They're not living in Eretz Yisrael. The only possibility to be Machayev is the voluntary Kabbalah, and on that there was the Maidah Rabbah. This is how it comes out from the Gemara. But this is what the Meshech HaChamim teaches us. That the Kafla in Hargigis is a metaphor. It's a metaphor for a prophetic experience which has such clarity and power that it is compelling, that it obligates. There's an amazing Rashi in this week's Parsha. We've talked about it in past years. The Torah is telling us about Moshe Rabbeinu in the days before Maimon Har Sinai, going up and down the mountain. It says they came on Rosh Chodesh Sivan. On the second day of Sivan, Moshe went up. And it says that Moshe Rabbeinu came down on the second of Sivan, and he told the Ziknei Ha'am all the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so on and so forth. Finally, it says that on the fourth day of Sivan, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe, V'yomer Hashem Moshe, Hinei anechi bo elecha ba'al he'onon, I'm going to come to you in a cloud, Ba'var yishma ha'am b'dabri imach, the people should hear that I speak to you, V'gam b'cha yamim la'olam, and they'll believe in you forever. V'yagid Moshe es divrei Amar Hashem, and Moshe reported back the words of the people. V'yomer Hashem lo Moshe, Hashem said to Moshe, so go to the people and have them prepare for 3 days, and then after that will be the revelation in Har Sinai. So Rashi is troubled that what does it mean that after Hashem tells Moshe, I'm going to come to you in a cloud and speak to you, that Moshe reported back the words of the people? What response was called for here? Rashi says an amazing pshat, because he takes note of the fact that it doesn't say, I'm going to come in a cloud and speak to the people. He said, I'm going to come in a cloud in order that the people should hear that I'm speaking to you. Ba'var yishma ha'am b'dabri imach. The people should hear that I'm speaking to you. Mashal l'mad avadayma. Let's say, for example, two of us were having a conversation in one corner of the room. So a person at the other end of the room could hear that we are having a conversation, but he wouldn't necessarily hear what we're saying. Because he could hear voices, but he wouldn't hear the words. So it says here, Hashem said, I'm going to speak to you in a cloud, and the people will hear that I'm speaking to you. They won't necessarily hear what I'm saying, but they will perceive that I am speaking to you. So the Moshe reported back the people's words. And what were the people's words? So Rashi says an amazing thing. Tshuva al dover zeh shemati mehem. I heard a response from the people. Sheritzaynam lishmaya mimcha. They want to hear the Torah from you. Eino doima hashameya mipi shliach lishemeya mipi hamelech. There's no comparison between a person who hears it from a messenger and a person who hears it directly from the king. Ritzonenu liros es malkeinu. We want to see the king. We want to see our king. Rashi apparently understood that HaKadosh Baruch Hu originally, plan A, was not to speak directly to the people. It would be that Hashem would speak to Moshe, and the people would overhear, so they would know that Moshe was the Navi Emes, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu wouldn't speak to them. And the people rejected that. The people said, no, we want to hear it straight from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the next pasuk says, Hashem told Moshe, tell them to go and prepare to clean their clothes and fence in Har Sinai. So Rashi adds, V'yomar Shema Moshe, im kain, if so, shemaskikin l'daber imam, if they are requiring that I speak to them, so go to them and tell them to prepare. Meaning there wouldn't have been preparations otherwise. Because if the people would have only overheard God speaking to Moshe, There would have been no need for preparations. But Hashem said, but if the people are demanding that I speak to them, so they want to have a personal prophetic experience, now they have to prepare. They have to prepare for 3 days. So that was the 4th, 5th, and 6th, and the revelation was on the 7th. During those 3 days, on one of those 3 days, the 5th, there was a ceremony, a krisas bris, which is described in PARSHA Mishpatim, and that was the occasion at which the Jews said Nasa v'Nishma. According to the Meshech Chochmah, that Ritzoneinu Liros Es Malkeinu, that desire to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that itself is the Kaf Aleim HaKegigis. That is the holding of the mountain over their heads like a barrel. Right? The Kaf Aleim HaKegigis isn't literal. It's that when you have a prophetic experience of your own, it's compelling. And that's what the Jews asked for. It was not supposed to be. It was supposed to be only HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu and the Jews overhearing that they should know that Moshe is a Navi Emes, that he's a true prophet. But they said, no, we're Tzonenu Liros Es Malkeinu. That means we want to have that prophetic experience, that compelling experience. That's what they wanted. So the question is, Tosfos asks, if they anyway said Nasa v'Nishma on the 5th, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu hold the mountain over them like a barrel? The answer is because they asked for it. Because they wanted it. That's the answer. Itaka wasn't necessary. But they wanted it. And that's how HaKadosh Baruch Hu did it. That's Tosfos' question. Why did Hashem do it? The answer is because the people asked for it. Itaka wasn't necessary. They said Nasa v'Nishma on the 5th of Sivan. But they said with Tzonenu Liros Es Malkeinu, we want to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Hashem said, okay, very good. I'll let you see. And that's Mikan Modor Rabbi Eliezer. I just want to point out the interesting thing. That this is part of human nature. We all want to be in control. We never want to be forced to do anything. You know, it's a strange thing. There are things that we will do voluntarily, but once we're forced, I don't want to do it. Chazal pointed out. Chazal say, Gadol hamatzuva va'osa, yosem mishena matzuva va'osa. A person who is obligated to do the Torah has more schar for what he does than a person who does it voluntarily. So Rashi says, because there's a kfiyas yetzer, your yetzer hara kicks in when you're obligated. You know, this is the explanation for the amazing phenomenon that when you have children under bar mitzvah, they love to fast on Yom Kippur. You know, 11-year-old, 12-year-old, they just want to fast, When they turn 13, they start complaining, I'm starving, I can't do it, I'm hungry. But as long as it's voluntary, there's no problem. So when it becomes obligatory, then there's the yetzer hara. We don't want to be forced. Now, I'll do anything for my husband, anything for my wife, but if I have to do it, then all of a sudden I go on strike. I don't want to do it. That's the kaflei markegigis. That's the modar Rabbi Eliezer. It was as long as there was some element of choice, then the Jews happily accepted the Torah, Nasa v'Nishma. Once they had that compelling experience of Tzonenu Liros Es Malkeinu, then it's already under duress. It's already annoying us. We don't want it. We don't want to be pushed around. We don't want to be told what to do. Perhaps that's the explanation why Purim is the tikkun. Purim is the solution to this problem. Purim was dafka at a time of Hester Panim. Dafka at a time of concealment. When there was no compelling vision. Meaning, in the Purim story, we were given a choice. not a choice as to if I believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, must I accept his mitzvahs? But do I perceive HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a presence in the world? It's time of concealment. It's a time of Hester upon him. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is seemingly uninvolved. But now you have a story with such an unusual chain of coincidences that it can be read two ways. Either it points to Hashgacha, it points to a God who is engaged in the world and micromanages the affairs of man, or perhaps to the opposite, that things are random and just happen. That's the big choice that we have on Purim, how to look at the world. If we choose to look at the world as being random, so obviously there are obligations. If we choose to look at the world as being something which is subject to God's hashgacha, then we are obligated. But how we will look at the world is ultimately our choice. And that's why the Kabbalah Satire of Purim doesn't have the problem of the Kabbalah Satire of Shavuos. By Shavuos, where it was Vayisyatzu B'tachta Sahar, even if I assume, like the interpretation of the Meshech Chachma, that it was a prophetic vision of such clarity that it was compelling, but because it's compelling, that's why I feel a sense of duress. I feel a sense of compulsion, which is distasteful. By Purim, there was no sense of compulsion because there was a very fundamental choice the Jews were given, how they look at the world. Of course, if I look at the world as being run by God, of course I now become obligated. But since it's my choice to look at the world that way, I don't feel a sense of duress. I see an alternative. It's an interesting thing. We read in the last Parshias about Paro, how his heart was hardened. Makkah after Makkah, plague after plague, and he hardens his heart. Hashem hardens his heart. So you wonder that what was the mechanism by which HaKadosh Baruch Hu hardened his heart? Like, what did HaKadosh Baruch Hu do? The Rambam understands he took away his free will. The Sforno understands he gave him an unusual ability to bear suffering. There may be another approach to the mechanism. Because Paro probably had this personality flaw as well, since we all have it, undoubtedly he had it too. That no one wants to be pushed around. No one wants to be told what to do. And my guess is that Paros were more afflicted by this than the rest of us. Because think about it, in the culture of Mitzrayim, Paro is the one person who was not told what to do. I think we pointed out in the past that the word Mitzrayim means mitzarim, it means constraints. Everyone in Mitzrayim was a prisoner, everyone was constrained. The word paro, parua, means unrestrained, loose, unbound. That's the nature of Paro. Paro was free. He was the only truly free person in the entire society. And everyone else was in a straitjacket, in mitzarim, and Paro was parua. He's totally unrestrained. He could do whatever he wants. No one tells him what to do. And now Paro has experiences which are very compelling. Dam, Tzvardei Akidim, they're brought by a God who seems to be the creator of all things, the manager of all things. That's very, very compelling. You have to listen, you have to obey. So what do you think the response of Paro to that will be? To dig in his heels deeper. If by nature, by temperament, you're the type of person you don't want to be told what to do, so the more compelling the command is, the greater resistance there is. Gadol HaMitzvah, says Chazal say. The more you feel a sense of obligation, the more you resist that. That means the more compelling the obligation, the greater the resistance. And therefore, Paro was given an experience of such power and clarity that given his personality flaw, what would you expect? Of course he'd have to harden his heart and make his heart heavy and lethargic to disobey. There probably were days that he felt so compelled to do the right thing, he just had to go to bed to make sure that he did the wrong thing. But that is the Modah Rabal Araisa. That is the Kafalei Margigigas. In other words, when the vision, as the Meshech Chochmah says, is so compelling to the extent that there's no choice, that's when there's a massive resistance, a resentment. We don't want to be pushed around. Purim is precisely different, because Purim leaves us with a fundamental choice of how we are going to view the world. Therefore, the Kabbalahs we make on Purim are ultimately Kabbalahs that are free Kabbalahs. Says, of course, if we see God as running every aspect of the world, of course we're compelled. But how we're going to look at the world itself, that is our choice. That's why the Kabbalah Torah Purim is not under duress.